This ship chat is a request by Commander Guillermo Martinez. If you want to request a ship chat, then consider joining at the Commander tier. Right, so by request today of Guillermo Martinez, we're going to be looking at the D-Kyr. Just by way of introduction, I will say that I will actually be covering both this and the Kumari, and then we will probably do a whole fleet doctrine comparison between the Vulcan fleet and the Andorian fleet of the 22nd century, because it's a very interesting comparison of what could have been the biggest war of the 22nd century. Arguably would have been bigger than the Romulan Earth War. We'll get to that. And also because 22nd century ships, they're really unique and different. So, I mean, let's just get into it. So, the D-Kyr was designed by John Eves and then built by Pierre Droulet. It first appeared in Shockwave Part 2, but the most memorable appearance, or the first memorable appearance, was in Ceasefire, where you have two of them squaring off against Andorian Kumaris. And then it kind of after that, it became the go-to Vulcan ship. We didn't see much more of the Surak/Sharan class, which was the original design to be used. And it's based, obviously, on the Matt Jeffries Enterprise ring ship design. But basically, obviously, it was a Vulcan. Oh, and you can play it in Star Trek Online, and it's colossal. That's another thing that we will get to with this ship in universe as well. But it is available in Star Trek Online if you're very lucky. I think, if you're very lucky. So in universe, right, the Vulcans named this a combat cruiser, which is the biggest understatement of the 22nd century. This is huge. It is 600 meters long. Now, granted, we talk about, internal volume and everything. It's quite flat. It's got a big hole in the middle. It's certainly not anywhere near the volume of a Galaxy or Ambassador class. Probably closer to around about an Excelsior in terms of overall volume. But this is a big ship for the 22nd century. I mean, you look at what the other powers are putting out, and this is huge. This is the Romulan warbird of the 22nd century, which, funnily enough, was why Guillermo Martinez wanted me to cover it. It's basically another side of the Romulan coin. This is what their cousins were up to, and you can see the commonalities in that sort of design philosophy. Certainly with regards to size, both of them seem to like big ships. But this is very much unlike the Sharan, which was arguably more of an exploration ship. I mean, it was still big and it was still powerful. The D-Kyr was much, much tougher and is very clearly built for combat, which is, A, why it's identified as a combat cruiser, and B, why we see it used in a much more belligerent and aggressive role than we ever see the Sharan being used in. The Sharan strikes me as something that is just very fast, and we'll get to that if we do a ship chat on the Sharan. But the D-Kyr is much more built for battle. So there's a couple of interesting design decisions which indicate that to me. One of those is that the warp ring, your main source of propulsion, is mounted internally. On the Sharan, it goes around the outside of the ship's structure. The D-Kyr, it's within the ship's superstructure. Now, proportionally, that means that the Sharan has a bigger warp ring, better warp field, faster. But if you're an enemy shooting at the Sharan, the first thing you're going to aim for, simply because it takes up a lot of space, is the warp ring. It's the most obvious thing to shoot at. With the D-Kyr, it's not actually the most obvious thing to shoot at. You'd rather shoot at all that hull. And even if you do want to shoot at it, it's got another trick up its sleeve. It can fold the warp ring away to be basically flush with the rest of the hull. So it's then protected, and then it's much, much harder to hit. Now, obviously, it means you can't go to warp. Certainly not anytime soon. Can't be doing it quickly, but it is available to you, particularly if you are going to be getting into a very rough combat situation and, you're planning to slug it out rather than push through, then yeah, probably you'll fold away your warp ring and just hunker down and fight it out. Additionally, because of this kind of setup where the hull goes outside the warp ring, it actually has a lot more maneuverability than the Charan. Because essentially you have the impulse engines, a pair of impulse engines either side, which gives it a much greater sort of, axis of maneuver, as compared to the Charan, where the impulse engines are close to the center of gravity and very close to one another. So it's much harder to kind of pivot it at impulse. There's also no way that the Charan was going to turn at warp, because there's no play in the warp field. But because the warp field has to be bigger on the D-Kyr, because the warp field has to be bigger than the hull in order to get around the hull, that then means that there's a little bit of play in the warp field so that you can then turn. It's still not going to be the best turner at warp, but it can actually turn, which for a Vulcan ship is quite exceptional. And then again, another option in combat is that it has a smaller shield profile. And again, that's partially tied to it being able to fold away that warp ring. If you have the warp ring, your shield bubble is going to be quite big. But if you suddenly fold it away, that's then a very narrow shield profile. And given that Vulcan shields are probably the best in the quadrant, here we can already see how the D-Kyr is built to take hits. It's built to get into the thick of things. But what's it sending back the other way? Well, this is an interesting question. One problem we have here with the D-Kyr is that there's no discernible firing ports. Now, you might say, oh, well, it's the Vulcans. They want to kind of hide their weapons. They don't want to seem aggressive. These are 22nd century Vulcans. I don't really believe that. More likely it's due to the effects guys having previously not paid any attention to the weapons ports that the artists put on the ships. So the artists at this point have just given up and just given us, these lovely, nice, curvy, sleek hulls. And the effects guys will just put the beams wherever they want to. Now, I have had a look and sort of observed, and I can sort of see that there are a handful of key firing ports. You have at least 3 prow firing ports, a dorsal, middle, and ventral. You then have 4 beam firing ports, basically on that band next to the warp ring, firing dorsally and ventrally, and then 4 aft, basically at the 5 and 7 o'clock positions. And these are, of course, plasma cannons, which are devastating weapons up close. Vulcans and Romulans, that's another thing they have in common. They like their plasma. Plus, because it's green. That gives it good arcs of all-around firepower, and especially up close, with plasma cannons you can do a lot of damage. So I can imagine this ship just plunging into the middle of enemy formations, firing from all sides, and nothing's going to really penetrate its shields, and it's going to quickly melt anything that gets in its way. Now, Memory Alpha claims that this has photonic weapons, despite the fact that we never see it fire photonic weapons. Yes, I know in the Enterprise episode, the Kishara, that they do fire photonic weapons at the Cyrenite camp. I don't think that's the D-Kyr doing that. I do think it's a Vulcan ship, but I don't think it's the D-Kyr. And we'll come back to that when we look at the Vulcan fleet, because there is a candidate. There are possibly torpedo launchers in those front ports, but those look like navigational deflectors, which in itself is interesting, because you have a double navigational deflector system, which is... Now, at the same time, it possibly does have mine launchers in the aft, just because you have this cutout in the aft section, which looks like it would be very good for launching small ordnance, possibly mines, or other kind of, anything really. Probes, transmission relays, spy satellites. Now, speaking of spying, the D-Kyr is a honking great dreadnought. Let's not mince words about it. It's not the most subtle ship. However, it does have something that can do the job for it. Now, having a look at the shuttle bay, I think I worked out where it is. It's on it's a ventral launch bay, much like on the NX-01, and you can carry either 2 light shuttles or one of those survey ships. Not great capacity given the ship's size, but the main auxiliary craft that really anyone cares about is the daughter craft, which is sometimes known as the Tal-kir. It's a very elegant looking ship, very dramatic lines, very sweeping and very fast looking. Now, this is basically the attached scientific ship. This will go off and do science missions, and if it gets into too much trouble, the D-Kyr can always come along and get it out of trouble. It's also very fast as well. It's got, it's small, but has some good warp rings on it, so it's quite quick. So what the Tal-kir is very good for is force recon. It's a very good intelligence gathering ship because, essentially, you go out to the borders of Andorian space, have a little peek, see what's going on, and if the Andorians take exception and start chasing you down, well, you just run back home to your D-Kyr class Dreadnought, and the Andorians are gonna, okay, yeah, I guess we'll be on our way then. There's not really that much they can do when your recon units are backed up by your strongest ships. So it's a very good synergy between those two, and it enables the D-Kyr to deploy quite far out from, a normal fleet group, while still having a lot of tactical awareness. Now, another element of its docking facilities are docking ports on its port and starboard, adjacent to the warp ring, again on that sort of band. Now, these are generally used to attach the smaller Derval class attack craft, which are quite big. They're about 60 meters there, which is a pretty typical size for an attack craft in the 22nd century. What you end up getting, you think that, put all that together, you have some shuttles for landing on planets, you have a Tal-kir for going out and doing forward reconnaissance, and you also have 2 attack craft for close-in defense and protecting against other small ships. All that told, you basically have a full D-Kyr flotilla that is capable of operating on its own and having a good degree of tactical awareness and combat potential, whilst only being basically a single ship. In that way, it actually arguably inspires Romulan doctrine in the 24th century, where you have the warbird flotillas, where you have Romulan warbirds that are basically followed around by a small entourage of scout ships and escorts that themselves attach to the ship and use that as a mothership. So in terms of combat in the 22nd century, as a warship in the 22nd century, the D-Kyr is really unparalleled. It is capable of 1v1ing any ship. Any ship. Maybe apart from Xindi aquatic ships. But that's still, that's a hell of a heavyweight fight. And frankly, the Xindi aquatic ship does not strike me as the most durable thing. It looks pretty fragile, and it would not surprise me if the Vulcans could melt through those shields pretty quickly. But it could absolutely, in terms of contemporaries, you look at any Klingon ship, even the biggest Klingon battlecruiser, the D5, is not going to stand a chance against one of these things. Even 2 would probably have a tough time. This thing can just melt you so quickly at close range. Your best chance is just to plug away at long range with a D4. And you might be able to get away with it. But then again, you're not just fighting a D-Kyr. You're fighting all the other ships attached to it. The only ship that has a chance against the D-Kyr is the Andorian Kamari, and we'll cover why when we do that ship chat, but certainly it's got a lot of abilities that help balance against the D-Kyr's overwhelming strengths. So yeah, that's the D-Kyr. It really shows you what the Vulcans are capable of when they turn their minds to warfare and building warships. And my advice would be, if you see one out there, just stay out of its way. Vulcans are quite stubborn, and you don't really want to invite trouble from this thing. Thank you guys for watching. I'll see you all next time.